The cowboy hat, the six-shooter, the lone gunfight at high noon. None of it was real. The cowboy hat came from Hollywood. Most cowboys never fired a gun in their lives, and the gunfight at high noon was invented by a novelist who had never been west of Ohio. The real Old West was stranger than any of that, a town where the mine killed more people than every outlaw combined. A lawman who arrested 3,000 criminals and nobody made a movie about him for 100 years. 22 facts, every one of them true, every one of them buried. Here is what they didn't want you to find. Number 22. The first saloon in the American West was built to serve fur trappers, not cowboys. The saloon is inseparable from the mythology of the cowboy. But the first documented Western saloon appeared in 1822 at Brown's Hole, Wyoming, decades before the cattle drive era began. It was built entirely to serve fur trappers working the Rocky Mountain trade routes. No cowboys, no sheriffs, no six-shooters, just men who smelled of beaver pelts and needed somewhere to drink after months in the wilderness. The saloon preceded the cowboy by 50 years, which means the entire cultural association between the two was assembled after the fact. The cowherds came later. The whiskey was already waiting. By the time the first cattle drives began in the 1860s, the saloon had already been a fixture of Western life for 4 decades. Hollywood needed a backdrop and grabbed the one that was already built. The saloon was already there. Number 21. The word gunslinger was never used during the Old West. Every Western film ever made uses the word gunslinger. It appears in novels, television shows, and documentaries about the frontier era as though it were the standard term of the day. It was not. The word gunslinger does not appear in any documented source from the period it supposedly describes. It was coined in the 20th century, well after the era had ended, by writers constructing a mythology around events they had not witnessed. The men who actually carried guns in the frontier West were called shootists, pistoliers, or simply gunfighters. Gunslinger is a Hollywood invention applied backward onto a history that never used it. Number 20. The most famous gunfight in history did not happen where you think. The gunfight at the OK Corral is one of the most retold events in American history. There is one problem. The gunfight did not take place at the OK Corral. The actual shooting happened in a narrow alley on Fremont Street, several lots away from the corral itself. The whole thing lasted approximately 30 seconds. 9 men were involved. 3 died. And the reason the fight started at all was not a gambling dispute or a territorial standoff. It was a gun control violation. Tombstone had Ordinance Number 9, requiring all visitors to check their firearms upon entering town. The Clanton and McClory brothers refused. Virgil Earp deputized Wyatt and Doc Holliday to enforce it. The most famous shootout in Old West history was a law enforcement action over illegal open carry. Nobody was defending a town from bandits. Nobody was avenging a murdered brother. They were enforcing a weapons storage ordinance. The dime novelists left that part out. Number 19. The town the mine turned into a widow factory. In Nevada, a gold mining town called Delamar ran at full capacity through the 1890s. At its peak, roughly 1,500 people lived there. At that same peak, the town was home to more than 400 widows. Not because of outlaws or gunfights, because the gold mill ground ore into a fine white silicon dust that floated through every street and every set of lungs in the settlement. Inhaled over months, it became silicosis, a lung disease that killed slowly and without mercy. The mill owners knew. The company doctors knew. Nobody stopped the mill. When the ore ran out in 1900, Delamar had earned a name that appeared in newspapers across the country. They called it the Widowmaker. When the gold was gone, the company left. The widows stayed. Number 18. 1 in 4 cowboys was black, and Hollywood erased every single one of them. After the Civil War, tens of thousands of formerly enslaved men moved west. Many already had the skills the cattle industry needed because they had been forced to develop them on southern plantations. Historians studying payroll records and cattle drive rosters consistently estimate that between a quarter and a third of all working cowboys in the post-war West were black. Some drove cattle from Texas to Kansas. Some became ranch foremen. Some became lawmen. The dime novelists who invented the mythology of the Old West did not write about them. The film studios that turned those novels into movies did not cast them. For nearly a century, an entire workforce was written out of the story of the West they helped build. Number 17. The most effective lawman in Old West history was born a slave. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in Arkansas in 1838. During the Civil War, he escaped into Indian Territory and lived among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations. He learned to speak multiple native languages, to track, and to shoot. In 1875, federal judge Isaac Parker hired him as a deputy U.S. Marshal to cover 75,000 square miles of Indian Territory. Over the next 35 years, Reeves arrested more than 3,000 outlaws. He was shot at countless times. He was never hit once. He arrested his own son for murder when no other deputy would take the warrant. He died in 1910. His grave location is unknown. A court records archivist contacted for research decades later said simply, "We did not keep black people's history here. The man who arrested more criminals than any other lawman in the history of the frontier left no marked grave and no monument. The outlaws he caught are buried in named plots. He is not." Number 16. Tombstone had stricter gun laws than most American cities do today. The Wild West is the defining symbol of unrestricted firearm ownership. The historical record says otherwise. A photograph exists of a sign posted at the edge of Tombstone, Arizona in 1880. It reads, "In full, the carrying of firearms strictly prohibited." Visitors were required to surrender their weapons at the first saloon they encountered and collect them upon leaving. Dodge City had the same rule. Abilene enforced it so rigorously that cowboys who refused were physically removed from the town limits. The gunfight culture of the Old West was not the norm. It was the exception. And in most frontier towns, the law came down hard on anyone who tried to make it otherwise. Number 15. Wyatt Earp was not in charge at Tombstone and built his entire legend on interviews given 40 years later. Wyatt Earp held no official position in Tombstone on the day of the gunfight. His brother Virgil was the town marshal. Wyatt was a private citizen. Virgil deputized him temporarily, minutes before the confrontation, to help enforce a firearms ordinance. Wyatt Earp's entire legend as the lawman of Tombstone rests on 30 seconds of street violence in which he was a temporary volunteer deputy. The mythology was built largely by Earp himself in interviews given in the 1920s, decades after the events, to a writer named Stuart Lake, who later admitted to embellishing extensively. Earp understood that the mythology was more valuable than the facts. He was right. Number 14. A former janitor performed the first successful surgery of its kind in the American West. In 1827, near Newton, Ohio, a woman arrived in the night requiring immediate surgical intervention. The only available person with any medical knowledge was John Richmond. who had worked as a janitor at a medical school, attending lectures from the hallway. He had never performed surgery and had never seen the procedure the patient required. He performed it anyway, by candlelight, on a kitchen table, without anesthesia. It was a cesarean section. The mother survived. The child did not. The mother's survival was so improbable that the case was written up in medical journals as a landmark event. The surgeon had no degree, no training, and no equipment beyond what a frontier household contained. The patient had no other option and no time to find one. Number 13. Old West dentists pulled teeth from corpses and sold them to the living. Trained dentists were nearly non-existent on the frontier until the 1870s. When one was available, the only treatment for a bad tooth was extraction, performed without anesthesia, using pliers and brute force, with whiskey as the only concession to pain. For those who needed replacements, the solution was a market that had existed since the 18th century. Grave robbers collected teeth from battlefield dead and sold them to dentists, who transplanted them into paying patients. The practice was known in England as Waterloo teeth, after the battlefield where large quantities were harvested, and it made its way west. The demand was real. The supply was wherever the dead happened to be buried. These are the stories that got left out of every history book you've ever read. If you want more of them, subscribe to Hidden History Files. Number 12. Calamity Jane nursed a smallpox ward back to health at gunpoint. Calamity Jane is remembered as a drinker, a brawler, and a self-promoter who embellished her own legend extensively. Some of what she claimed about herself was fiction. One event, however, was documented by eyewitnesses and is entirely true. When smallpox struck Deadwood in the 1870s, 8 miners were quarantined in tents outside of town, without water, medical care, or any expectation of survival. Calamity Jane had survived smallpox as a child and was immune. She walked into the camp alone with herbs and Epsom salts. When grocery deliveries were delayed, she drew a gun and made certain the suppliers came through. 5 of the 8 men lived. The town's physician stated that without her, all 8 would have died. Calamity Jane received no payment, no official recognition, and no mention in the town's formal records of the outbreak. The credit went to the doctors who arrived after the crisis had already passed. Number 11. The U.S. Army imported camels to the Southwest, and it almost worked. In 1855, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis approved a program to import camels from the Middle East and North Africa to serve as military transport animals in the American Southwest. The Army purchased 33 camels in the first shipment, then added 41 more. They performed exactly as intended, carrying heavier loads than mules over terrain horses could not manage, using a fraction of the water. The program was a documented success. It was killed by the mule lobby, which pushed back hard against the competition. When the Civil War began, the program was abandoned. Some camels were auctioned. Some escaped. There are documented accounts of feral camels wandering through Arizona as late as the 1880s, startling ranchers and spooking horses in a desert that had no living memory of the animal and no word for what it was looking at. Number 10. The iconic cowboy hat was not worn by actual cowboys. Historical photographs of working cowboys from the 1870s and 1880s consistently show the same headgear. The bowler hat, the round-topped derby worn by Eastern businessmen and gamblers. It was cheaper than a Stetson, more durable in wind, and less likely to blow off during a cattle drive. Butch Cassidy and members of the Hole in the Wall gang were photographed in bowler hats. The wide-brimmed Stetson was expensive, associated with ranch owners rather than working hands. The cowboy hat, as a cultural icon, was created by Wild West shows and early Western films in the 20th century, invented by the same entertainment industry that invented most of the mythology it accompanied. Number 9. Most cowboys never owned a gun. Firearms in the 1870s and 1880s were expensive, heavy, and impractical for managing cattle. A working cowhand rode 16 hours a day handling ropes, horses, and livestock. A heavy iron revolver was a liability, not an asset. Payroll records and personal accounts from cattle drives document that most working cowboys did not own firearms, and those who did rarely discharged them. The gunslingers of the Old West were a specific subgroup: gamblers, outlaws, lawmen, and showmen. The average cowboy punching cattle from Texas to Kansas never fired a shot in his working life. The gun was the symbol of the West. The rope was the tool. Number 8. The man who killed Lincoln's assassin threatened to shoot the Kansas state legislature and vanished from history on a stolen horse. Boston Corbett shot John Wilkes Booth in a Virginia barn in 1865, against direct orders to take him alive. He was arrested, then released when public sentiment ran in his favor. In 1887, now working as a doorkeeper for the Kansas House of Representatives, Corbett drew his revolver during a legislative session and threatened to shoot several congressmen for what he considered disrespectful behavior during a prayer. He was committed to the Topeka Asylum for the Insane. In May 1888, he stole a horse, escaped from the grounds, and was never found. The man who killed Abraham Lincoln's assassin vanished from documented history in the middle of Kansas and was never seen again. Number 7. Jesse James was buried in his own front yard, and someone later claimed to be him at age 101. When Jesse James was shot dead in 1882, his family buried him in the front yard of the James farm in Kearney, Missouri, rather than a public cemetery, to prevent the body from being stolen or displayed. Decades later, a man in Granbury, Texas, named J. Frank Dalton, aged 101, announced he was the real Jesse James and had lived under a false identity for decades. A Texas court allowed him to legally change his name to Jesse James and have it placed on his headstone. The body in Kearney has since been exhumed and DNA tested, confirming identity with the James bloodline. The Texas grave still reads Jesse James. Number 6. The term red light district came from one specific door in Dodge City. The phrase red light district is used in every major language on Earth. Most people have no idea where it came from. In Dodge City, Kansas, during the cattle drive era, one brothel on the south side of the deadline had a front door made of red glass. When lit from inside, the door glowed red and was visible from the street. The color spread from the building to the block to the district to the concept itself, then traveled east with newspapers and west with dime novels until it crossed the Atlantic and entered the vocabulary of cities that had never heard of Dodge City. One red glass door on a Kansas brothel in the 1870s produced a phrase the entire world still uses today. Number 5. Wild Bill Hickok was nearly killed over a painting of a bull. In 1871, in Abilene, Kansas, the owners of the Bull's Head Saloon painted a mural on the side of their building depicting a bull in explicit anatomical detail. The town demanded its removal. The owners refused. City Marshal Hickok climbed a ladder and painted over the offending portion himself. The furious owners hired a gunman to kill him. The gunman was killed in the resulting confrontation instead. 2 men died in Abilene that year as a direct consequence of a mural on a wooden wall. Neither appears in any Western film about Hickok. Number 4. The OK Corral gunfight lasted 30 seconds, and most of the shots missed. 30 seconds. That is the documented duration of the most famous gunfight in American history. More than 30 shots were fired in a space roughly the size of a living room. 3 people died. The hit rate at close range was, by any standard, appalling. Doc Holliday hit 1 person. The McClory brothers fired multiple shots at point-blank range and missed. Ike Clanton, who had started the confrontation the night before, dropped his gun and ran the moment the shooting began. The mythology of the Old West gunfighter as a precision killing machine rests on 30 seconds of chaos in which most bullets missed. Number 3. The dime novels that created the Wild West myth were written by people who had never been there. The entire popular image of the Old West, the lone gunfighter, the fast draw, the noble lawman, was manufactured by a publishing industry based in New York City. Dime novels sold for 10 cents and were produced in enormous quantities from the 1860s onward. The writers worked fast, often producing several titles a month, and most had never traveled west of the Appalachian Mountains. They constructed a version of the West that Eastern readers found thrilling. The heroes were white, the shootouts were decisive, and the moral lines were clear. The real West was more complicated, more diverse, and considerably less cinematic. But the dime novel version became the template. When film arrived, it adapted the dime novel mythology almost without revision. The West that the world believes in today was written in Manhattan by men who had never seen it. Number 2. Annie Oakley offered to raise a female military unit for 2 different wars and was rejected both times. Annie Oakley had performed before Queen Victoria, toured Europe, and been adopted into the Lakota Nation by Sitting Bull himself. In 1898, she wrote personally to President McKinley, offering to raise 50 expert female sharpshooters at her own expense for the Spanish-American War. He declined. She made the same offer in 1917 when the United States entered the First World War. She was rejected again. Both letters are documented. The most skilled shooter in the country was turned away twice by an institution that needed exactly what she was offering because it could not accommodate the idea of women performing it. Number 1. The entire mythology of the Old West was created by one man who was actively making it up as he went. William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill, was a genuine frontiersman who had scouted for the Army and participated in the buffalo hunting that gutted the Great Plains herds. He was also a showman of extraordinary talent who understood, earlier than almost anyone, that the frontier era was ending and nostalgia for it could be sold. Starting in 1883, his Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured the United States and Europe, drawing crowds of 20 to 40,000 per performance. It featured Annie Oakley, Sitting Bull, Calamity Jane, and reenactments of gunfights, all theatrical, rehearsed, and designed for maximum impact. Audiences came away believing they had witnessed the authentic West. What they had witnessed was Buffalo Bill's version of it, constructed to entertain rather than to inform. The dime novelists took their cues from the show. The filmmakers took their cues from the dime novelists. The entire cinematic mythology of the Old West descended from one man's traveling theater production. Buffalo Bill knew exactly what he was doing. He just did not expect the fiction to outlast the century. The real Old West was buried under 100 years of fiction. Subscribe to Hidden History Files, and we will keep digging it up. Every fact in this video came from a real archive, a real ledger, or a real grave. None of it was in the movie.